All right, and we're back with candidate for State Attorney General, GreggSkordas. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start a little bit about you, your background.
So I started my career as a public defender, worked at the Salt Lake Legal Defenders Association, which represents people accused of crimes who can't afford an attorney. Went to the Salt Lake District Attorney's Office and was a prosecutor there for 8 years. I started out sort of doing misdemeanors, worked my way up to felonies, and ultimately did even homicide cases. I was actually Utah's first gang prosecutor, 1992. We hadn't had gangs as a major criminal problem until then. And then I went to what's called the Special Victims Unit, and I was the head of that, which is the sex crimes and crimes against children. I did that for several years and ultimately became the chief deputy Salt Lake County attorney, which is sort of the number 2 person in the office. Left that office, started my own firm, which I've had pretty good success with over the last 20-some years. I represent 2 police unions, the Utah Highway Patrol Association and the Fraternal Order of Police. I represent the Utah Rape Recovery Center. I do a lot of victim advocacy. And my practice is a lot of criminal defense work and that type of stuff. That's kind of what people know me as, is doing criminal defense practice. But I've had a pretty distinguished, or a good career. I shouldn't tout my own horn too much, but it's been a good career. It's really been good.
I mean, as a candidate, that's what you do. You got to toot that horn. Toot, you know.
That's what I try to do.
Tell me, I think it's kind of interesting because right now, as we're going through historic moments with police reform, and you as a Democrat running for Lieutenant Governor or Attorney General, sorry, that tell me what that's like and how you are balancing that and what police reform looks like for you.
So that's a great question, because a lot of people think if you're a Democrat that you're sort of into defunding the police, and that's not my agenda. And I don't even think it's a Democratic agenda.
Right.
But police reform is coming down the tracks. I mean, police reform is something that needs to happen. And I've been traveling around the state, talking to police groups, talking to minority groups, talking to civic groups about what police reform is going to be over the next few years. And I think that police are receptive to it. They're receptive to having more, more training in sort of de-escalation, more training in dealing with people of different races, more training in police officers are so tough, so proud, that when they're involved in critical incidents, sometimes it's hard for them to sit back and say, I need some help. I just dealt with something very difficult. Maybe I need to see a counselor, and that's a hard nut to swallow for a lot of police officers. So a lot of times police officers can get burned out, and maybe there's some way to get more counseling to them, more training for them, and how to deal with some of these situations that have been a problem. And I think what we're doing, the way we're headed with some of these police reform, is going to work. I think it's going to be good, and frankly, it's not scaring police. It's not getting them as nervous as you might think they would be, like, hey, are we going to be defunded? We're not going to defund the police. But there is a little bit different allocation of resources where police can still have the funds that they need, but they can also get the help that they need. One thing, and I'm babbling a bit, I'm old enough and I practiced long enough to remember before we had dash cams in cars, and police were hesitant to have those because, hey, they're kind of exposed. Right. And that was like 25 years ago, but it's been great. And it proves that what police do is actually justified, and it's shown that police do the right thing. Well, now we have body cams over the last 5 years, and that was sort of like, whoa, now you're literally looking in the eyes of the police officer when he or she does something. And that has proven to be, by and large, better for police than not having it. So a lot of agencies can't afford body cams for all their police officers. A lot of smaller agencies that really don't have the funding. But if we're going to change funding for police, it should be to allow more of that, directing from some other parts of it, and so that we can have more. Really, I think body cams should be on every police officer, because it will, in the long run, it will help the police officers. It really will. I sincerely feel that way.
And so do you feel like, with your familiarity with the police unions, like, are they sympathetic to the idea of having other service providers be called to respond to certain types of things, or do they see that as a threat?
Both. I mean, you're right. You're right. So, I mean, a perfect example of that is an officer who's involved in a shooting from a remote county would want somebody from that county to help do the investigation. Well, we've gotten away from that. And so, no, to avoid the appearance of impropriety, to avoid the conflict of interest, if you're in Daggett County, Uinta County's going to investigate it. If you're in West Valley City, Salt Lake County's going to investigate it. If you're in South Salt Lake, West Jordan will investigate it, so that we don't have the conflict. We don't have the appearance of conflict. And so police officers are like, well, you still think, well, is somebody going to have my back? But county attorneys look at these cases also, and they have to put on their independent hat and say, look, I mean, you saw what happened with Sim Gill with his Carbajal case. He chose not to file criminal charges, and his office was vandalized. And
Right.
But that's just. I mean, I've investigated those when I was at the DA's office, and I represent police officers, and they're so difficult. You have an officer involved in a situation, and then he or she makes a decision in a second, and we take 6 months to scrutinize it and say, well, maybe you should have done this, and maybe you should have done that. And so, but I think police are, by and large, understanding that that's the way the system's going to work, and that the best thing that we can hope for is that there's an objective analysis of their conduct, so that the public doesn't turn over cars, and doesn't destroy buildings, and doesn't break windows, and that these things are vetted and people have a clear understanding of what the officer did and why, and that it was justified or that it wasn't.
A lot of the conversation is around police unions is about qualified immunity, and also the procedures that go into place after a shooting has occurred. I'm not totally familiar with how Utah and some of the police unions in Utah handle this. But as far as the transparency there, as far as we're not allowed to interview the police officer for 48 hours. I know that's a rule in lots of places. How are you going to, as someone who's, represented police unions, also going to balance and try to fight against some of the things that citizens feel like police unions are inhibiting the right, our ability to get to the bottom of some of these investigations?
So two things, and that's a very good question. I think that you need to have an independent body that investigates these, and perhaps the Attorney General's office can be the office that does that. But I do agree that an officer shouldn't be immediately questioned after a critical incident. I mean, if it's 48 hours, that's not the end of the world. 48 days would be bad.
That's different than what a citizen would get in a situation, though, correct?
Well, a citizen would have the same right to say, I want to talk to an attorney before I mean, we all have the right, the Fifth and Sixth Amendment right. And when an officer is involved in a critical situation, they have those same rights. So when I advise a police officer, I say, stand back. But the officer doesn't have a certain right that you and I have. So if you and I get involved in a shooting, we can say, I'm not talking, I'm going to take the Fifth Amendment. An officer doesn't have that privilege because they have, it's called garrity, and I won't get into the legalese of it, but basically, you either talk or you lose your job. You don't lose your job if you exercise the Fifth Amendment. So a police officer says, so they've got to come to me and say, well, should I talk or not? Because if I explain what I did, I'm going to be the subject of a criminal investigation, and if I don't, I'm going to get fired. So we have to evaluate. You need that 48 hours to weigh it. And the second thing is, we take much too long to resolve these cases. We shouldn't. That's where the public is correct. It shouldn't take 3 months to decide whether an officer's conduct was good or not. I mean, it's going to take more than 48 hours. But that's the situation where we should say, these cases need to be resolved in 30 days, and the body cams need to be released within 30 days. And the dash cams need to be released within some period of time. Yeah. Maybe it's even shorter than that. But there's no reason for these police investigations to take a year. And if you think about some small department, maybe they've got 10 or 12 officers, and one of their officers is being investigated for 6 months. That's 10% of their police force that's still getting paid but not doing any work. So it's unfair to the officer because they're sitting home sweating every day, not knowing what's going to happen. It's unfair to the victims because they want some closure, and it's unfair to the public because they're like, what happened in this case? So your point is extremely good, but transparency and expedient. Let's get these things investigated, and let's do it right, and let's make a decision and move on.
I know another thing people are interested in your race is the medical marijuana in this state. So I would just like to get your take on sort of what you think about the state of it now, where you think it needs to be fixed going forward.
So the public went to the ballot box in 2018, Proposition 2, medical cannabis. And they said, look, Utah legislature, we've all told you that we think this is a good idea, but you won't do anything about it. So we're going to do it ourselves. They passed 3 ballot initiatives that year because the Utah state legislature wouldn't do anything. So medical cannabis was passed. It's been 2 years, and it's largely been ignored by the legislature. I mean, we have some dispensaries that are coming up slowly. You know, the regulations on what kind of doctors can prescribe and under what conditions they can prescribe have been sort of slow. And frankly, most of the people I know that are getting these medical marijuana cards are saying, Greg, it's almost impossible. They're still driving to Colorado because Utah's charging 7 times what you can buy it for legally in Colorado or Nevada. So, I mean, it's our legislature's way of saying, we don't agree with you, voters, even though 53% of you thought this was a good idea, we're not going to support it, and they've made it as painful as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I do criminal defense work, and I think the last thing we need are more impaired drivers. So I think medical THC has a purpose, but I don't want anyone to think that that would give a license or excuse for people to drive while they're impaired, any more than they can with other legal drugs like oxys or sleep aids or something like that. So I mean, I'm also a bicyclist and a motorcyclist, so the last thing I want is impaired drivers on the street. You know what I mean? It's good for business, but we don't need that. So as long as we can maintain that marijuana is legal, but impairment is still a crime, and that it's available to people who need it, and it's not this painful process that we're going through. You think of some family that's got a child that's got epilepsy or is having seizures or something, and cannabis is a cure. It's a way to stop that, and it's just like having your teeth pulled to get a medical marijuana card. So, you know, we need to recognize that the people wanted that. It's a good question. People wanted it. The voters passed it, and the legislature needs to stand up to the plate. The Attorney General's been completely asleep at the wheel on this, because he represents the people.
Right.
The people said something. That's your client.
Right.
And he's telling the legislature, I don't want anything to do with this. Well, that's not your job. That's what your clients have told you to do.
It's a great point that everybody who's so frustrated with the way the legislator took that and changed it, their Attorney General could be an advocate for them.
Because the people passed a law. We don't usually think of that. The people sat down and said, here's a ballot initiative, here's the law. And the legislature's going, well, forget that. And the Attorney General's going, well, I don't know what to do. Well, you do know what to do. The people have spoken. The same with Prop 4, the same with Prop 5. We talk about, if you want to talk about expanded Medicaid, if you want to talk about this gerrymandering disaster we have. And our Attorney General has done nothing on any of those 3. In fact, worse, on Medicaid expansion, even though a majority of Utahns want it, he's joined a lawsuit nationally to do away with the Affordable Care Act altogether. I mean, how completely irresponsible to the people,
to your voters,
absolutely to your clients, to your people. So that's something that's one of the paramount reasons that I jumped into this race.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that, and it sounds like you can hear from the voters and go and fight for them in ways that our current Attorney General is not.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you just got me excited about the Attorney General race. I appreciate it.
Thanks
GreggSkordas, candidate for Attorney General. Good luck. Thank you so much for joining us down here.
Hey, thanks, you guys. This was fun. You guys were really good. This was a good dialogue. So
Thank you.
I
We
appreciate
appreciate
your high level of preparation too.
Yeah.
It was fun.